Hi, everyone. It's my pleasure to introduce one of our own, Josh Clinton, who is the Abby and John Winklereid Professor of Political Science here at Vanderbilt. He's also the co-director of the Center for the Study of Democratic Institutions and co-director for the Vanderbilt Poll. Josh earned his PhD from Stanford and then went to Princeton as a professor before moving here in 2009. He is part of the executive committee for the Data Science Institute that is hosting this event. And also is going to, I might add, teach our Introduction to Data Science course that's brand new and offered next fall as part of the data science minor. Since 2010, Josh has been working at the NBC News Decision Desk and is now, I think, a senior analyst there. And will tell us about that work. So take it away.
Well, thank you all for joining me. I know it's a nice day outside, and so I really appreciate you joining me in Zoom world to kind of hear what I do on election night, although now it's election week, and to give you a sense about how we use data and some of the complexity that's involved in what goes on. And so this is the people that if you turn on TV, you will see. You will not see me unless things go completely sideways on election night, which thankfully they have not done in recent years. But to just kind of push back to kind of give some historical context, that the network really started, looking at election and projecting elections with gusto in 1968. And so here's what NBC News looked like in 1968, where they basically took an entire studio and they crammed it full of people whose entire task was basically to get vote reports from all across the country, help tabulating, and then feed it to a giant machine, which you can kind of see in the background if you look way in the back. So what we do today is similar in style, but very different in terms of scope and size. In terms of, we have much more data, we have much more computing, and we have a much smaller team. And so this was the first year I worked there in 2010. So you can look at me looking kind of disgustedly at a screen down there in the lower right, trying to figure out what's going to go on the data set. But this is kind of what the decision desk looks like in 2010 during a normal election non-pandemic year. And so they put us all in a room with no windows to try to make sure that we convey information to the talent. And so what I want to do today is give you a sense about what goes on behind those closed doors, the data that we're looking at, some of the calculations that we're trying to do, and then some of the complexity that's involved in that task. It's a really interesting application as an academic because usually there's no pressure when I run a regression or do data analysis. Like no one really cares if I get it right. Now that's not exactly true. The viewers like it wrong, but like from what I can tell, I know plenty of famous people like Harvard, for example, who are like wrong all the time, but it hasn't really affected their professional reputation. In contrast, if you make an election wrong, right, you're going to get hauled before Congress to testify what goes on. And so it's like it's real-time data science in a pretty high stakes world that's very different than what we do normally in the academic world. And so that dichotomy both create some challenges and then also some interesting opportunities. So just to give it before I start jumping in, so this is exactly kind of what I would look like in a normal election year. We're not a pandemic. So again, there's a decision desk. It's within Rockefeller Plaza. So on election night or election week now, basically we kind of all come together to kind of make those calculations. That's actually my chair in Rockefeller Plaza on the right-hand side. And you can see that I have lots of screens. That way I can distract myself by surfing the internet while I'm waiting for the vote to come in. But kind of, there's a lot of computation and data that we're trying to analyze. And as you can see, it's as much almost as art as it is a science. Because we'll see that a lot of the kind of computations that we're making is not just a straight up statistical model, but it's trying to quantify the data that we have and the data that we don't have, and what we know about how vote is reported and counted and so forth. So this was kind of, again, what the entire team looked like in 2018, the last time we got together in New York. And you can see it's a range of individuals. And so when I walked into this back in 2010, it was primarily staffed by journalists and pollsters, to be honest, right? There wasn't a whole lot of expertise in terms of statistics, in terms of political science, but that is kind of evolving not only at NBC, but kind of across the board. And so again, it used to be the purview of pollsters. And so a lot of the methods that were being used were developed by people who are familiar with polling data and treating election data as the same. But as things have changed across time, now there's computer scientists, there's engineers, there's statisticians, there's political scientists, all trying to like figure out all the uniqueness of the way we analyze the data and then try to make a projection without being wrong. And so in 2020, it was a different world, as you know, right? It was like, so not only did we not have the election in New York City, although we still had an election, but now we had to move the entire election desk to Philadelphia. And the joy of that was that not only that was it in Philadelphia, but then also, you know, I got to have the joy of taking weekly COVID tests, but then like you also couldn't get on a plane because they're worried about infection. So then they made you drive Mad Max style across the country, basically from Nashville all the way to Philadelphia in one go without stopping, because they didn't want me to bring, you know, the COVID to Philadelphia. So that was a good time. And then being locked in the hotel room and not being allowed to leave that for another weeks was also a super good time. So that was kind of the, you know, my personal experience, but just to kind of give you a sense of like, this is what the actual decision desk looked like in 2020. And we were there for, I don't even remember how long it was anymore. So it was a long time. So you can kind of see there's a setup, there's lots of teams, there's lots of computers to kind of make the particular analysis. And so this is kind of what got me through the entire week. So again, we couldn't actually consume big bottles because that was the COVID risk. And so instead we went to the small bottles, but you know, you do what you do, right? So that was the nectar of the gods, as it were. So that's kind of enough a picture show, but let me kind of dive into exactly kind of what election night projection is. And so there's a couple of main players by which say people who are doing this on any given election night. So for one set of group, there's what's called the National Election Pool. So that consists of a private company called Edison Research, as well as NBC News, CNN News, CBS News, and ABC. So they all work together collaboratively to develop exit polls, to collect data, to analyze data, although each network does their own analysis. Kind of there's a collection that kind of works together throughout the electoral cycle to make, to kind of get ready for election night. Fox News used to be a part of that until 2016. So following 2016 election, Fox News broke off from that and basically started its own consortium with the Associated Press. And so you have the National Election Poll with Edison Research, NBC News, CNN, CBS, and ABC. And then you have Fox News and the Associated Press kind of doing their own vote counting and doing their own set of exit polls called the AP Votecast Survey with North at the University of Chicago. And then you have a few other organizations such as Decision Desk HQ that are more startups that are also, you know, competing in the space. And so again, when you talk about election night projections, you have three different groups that are engaging in it, and they all have different processes and they all have different data, which seems kind of crazy, but will become clear as I highlight some of the difficulties that are in there. And so what I know about is just the first part. Right, so I only know about what the National Election Pool does, and in particular, how NBC News interfaces with that to try to make a call of election night. But on the same time, there's other organizations that are using similar tools, I would hope, right, and similar data, I would certainly hope, to try to get to the same kind of answers. And so just a sense about there's different organizations that are trying to do the same task on election week. And so what are those tasks? And so if you think about what it means to work at a decision desk, that means that there's a couple tasks that you have to do, both leading up to the election and on election night itself. So one is that kind of seems pretty simple, is that you need to design, implement, and interpret statistical models in a way that allows you to project every federal race correctly and in a timely manner, right? And so the first thing you want to do is you never want to make a mistake because you never want to see Congress, especially now. And so you're trying to analyze that data, right, as quickly as you can to kind of figure out what happens, as best you can. You know, people say, well, why don't you just wait till the vote is actually certified? Which is a fair enough point in some sense. But then I also think that if you see like what happened in 2020, right, the process of understanding how vote comes in, how it's calculated, I think is an essential check to figure out kind of what were the voters saying and how is that impacted by the potential political infrastructure that surrounds that. Right. So again, the rules that we have in our country, as you will see, are very interesting. Right. And so I think that the process of projecting a vote on election night helps give some sense about what the country is thinking, and I think gives some validity to the outcome of a particular election. So that's one task we have, is actually analyze the vote as it comes in on election night to project who wins different federal races. Another task that's kind of related to that is to kind of write, conduct, and then analyze exit polls that are being done on election day or leading up to. So these are not project things that are used to project elections, but these are surveys of voters or likely voters that are used to help characterize and discuss what the actual electorate looks like, what people thought about, who voted, who didn't vote. So it's a different task from projecting election, although it's often, unfortunately, kind of meshed together. And sometimes it's unfortunately used like Fox News did when they're called the Arizona race. So the other thing that we do is that on election night, we have to analyze data, kind of feed that data to on-air talent, right? And so like on election night, often I'll have you kind of whispering in Steve Kornacki's ear, which is probably not the visual that you want, but trying to like tell him like what we think is going on in a particular state, that he, what we're looking for, how we think the data is coming in, what we are thinking about going forward. And so we need to kind of feed that content so they can tell the story of election night in an intelligible and correct manner. So that's something that else we're doing while we're trying to analyze the data we have. And then related to that was that we want to be able to analyze and stream some data to the talent and the viewer. So for example, exit polls, we need to analyze that, share that, and when we think that it is correct and correctly adjusted, so that can be consumed by the electorate. And so the other thing is like those estimates that we send have to be stable. So it's not, so the degrees of certainty that I have as an analyst, like I can live with uncertainty. So when I'm estimating, for example, how much expected vote is left, it's okay for me if those numbers jump around a lot because I can understand that, right? But if you put those numbers to compute to television graphics, right, there's a level of certainty that you have there that you can't have those numbers bounce around a whole lot because that creates an impression that things aren't really, as certain. And so there's a level of an art that how we translate what we have on the model side to what get displayed graphically and visually to kind of make sure, again, that we're not making error. So we don't say there's like way too many votes or way too few votes in terms of figuring out what we kind of present editorialized as the characterization of the electorate. So again, prior to election day, how does that back out in terms of what that means? So what that means is that we are constantly kind of revising the statistical models. Like, so as you know, there's always new rules and there's always new rules and there's always new data, right? So states are revising whether or not people can vote by mail or not, or whether or not, for example, they're going to use ranked choice voting, or even the data that they choose to provide and make publicly available in terms of how you access that data, or the ability to analyze voter file prior to election day to figure out who's already voted and who's already requested a ballot or not. So we're kind of revising them out to account for how the data is changing and how the votes are also going to be counted changes is something that's kind of ongoing and kind of critical for that. Moreover, tonight, thinking about how you write exit polls to get right questions and figuring out the right sampling schemes to make sure that you are getting a representative sample of people who are choosing to participate on election day is also critically important, especially as the type of votes that are being done is varying over time and also kind of across states. Thinking about how to devise the processes that are required to collect all the vote, as I'll talk about, takes an inordinate amount of time, right? Testing to make sure that the code that you write and the processes and the internet connections and everything it has kind of works correctly is important because you don't want things to crash in election night because that would be super, super bad. I mean, that's a technical term, right? And then also trying to use leading up to it voter file data, kind of surveys to kind of get hints about what might be happening on election night to kind of prepare yourself for what's going on, what's going to happen there. So on election night, which now seems to be election week, unfortunately, what does that look like? So one thing is that, so we start getting early returns of the exit poll, basically around noon. And so there was an agreement with Congress such that, once that data starts coming in, because that's sensitive, right? That's telling you information about how voters actually voted. Everyone who has access to that data is technically quarantined. So it used to be that there was an undisclosed location in New York City that you wouldn't know about until election night. And so when the exit polls were coming in, they'd put you in this car, they'd take you to this undisclosed location in Manhattan. You'd go to this building. The building would have no windows, so you couldn't do smoke signals or something to communicate with the outside world. They'd take your cell phone, they disable the wireless on your computer, and whenever you left the building, they'd send a guard with you. So like even if you went to the bathroom, like you'd be accompanied. Like it was just like off the charts insane over an exit poll. I mean, which, of an early exit poll, which if you believe those things, I've got a bridge to sell you, right? So like the amount of kind of concern that there was about this data leaking out was immense, right? So what does that mean? So early on election night, the only data that we have besides kind of, the kind of like the tendrils and voter file and survey stuff is early returns of the exit poll. And so a lot of kind of what we do is looking at those early returns of the exit polls and trying to figure out how do they look? how are they going to have to be adjusted to account for missingness and non-response, and try to find those statistical adjustments for the exit polls, because they are just a survey, and so they have the same limitations as normal surveys do, and so you have to have the same kind of skill set to try to figure out what they might learn. Then once the polls close, then you start getting incoming vote, right? And so hopefully then you just use the models that I'll talk about to help analyze and project what that means. But it also means that often the case that you have to develop bespoke models, like on the spot and on the fly, strip out data to try to figure out, like, what are the holes, like how is this election different from the last election? Like this election in particular was a complete nightmare, because like so many things were different and unanticipated that the models and the assumptions that were built didn't really correspond to the data that was seeing. And then the final thing is that, of course, you don't sleep, right? At least for a day or maybe two, right? But like after like 3 days, you're done, right? So that's kind of like, there's a lot going on, and it all hits like all at once. So again, I just want to give you a flavor of some of the things to think about, not necessarily because I can tell you the details, because I've signed too many NDAs to do that, but just to give you a sense to be like a better consumer about like what you see and how much confidence you should have about like some of the things that people should be doing if they're doing their job correctly afterwards. So the one thing is that we often conflate, and I know my siblings and my parents think, they think that we project elections based on exit polls, right? Based on the polls they're done. And that is absolutely not true. Like if you're doing your job correctly, you're not projecting on exit polls. As again, I'll tell you about Fox in Arizona. But instead, what exit polls are used for is they're basically a poll that allows the networks to tell a narrative about who voted, what they're concerned about, why they voted for Biden and not Trump, for example. Like that information you can't get from just a ballot. You just know who someone voted for. You don't know why. So exit polls help tell a story about the election, about some of the considerations that people are using when they were casting their ballot. So it's never ever used, or should never ever be used, to project a close race, right? Because at the end of the day, it is just a public opinion poll. Now, of voters, right, of people you're talking to outside a precinct and outside a polling place, but it's got all the same problems that a poll has in terms of non-response, in terms of all these issues that have to be statistically adjusted. And depending on the adjustments that you make, you can get that really wrong. So in particular, right, even though the people who respond to the exit poll are known voters, you still have issues of non-response, because not every person you try to talk to is willing to talk to you. Moreover, there's also all kinds of other issues. So for example, in 2008, when Obama was on the ballot, there were interviewer effects, right? So depending upon who the interviewer was and where that interviewer was, people may be reluctant to say whether or not they would have voted for Obama or not, for example, right? And so that can affect the validity of the results that you get. So the results that you get, or for example, think about this last election. Was it the case that Democrats were more enthusiastic to tell someone who they voted for than a Trump supporter? Presumably, yes. And so that would mean that the people that you're talking to aren't necessarily automatically representative of the people that you're not talking to. And so that means that you need to adjust the results. But early on, like at noon, when you've only talked to the first set of people who voted early in the morning, you have very little information about what that should look like. So again, there's a lot of uncertainty that you have trying to figure out, what is this data telling me about who's voting and who's not voting? And this is even more complicated in recent contemporary elections, because we have early voting and mail vote. So now not only do we have to think about what those voters look like, but even for the exit polls that are taken on election day, if you want to kind of interpret that as a representative of the entire electorate, you need to know how big that size is. Like what fraction of the voters are voting on election day? And that's not something that you know necessarily on election day, right? That takes months, unfortunately, to kind of know that with certainty. So again, the data that you have, it's useful, but it's only useful insofar as the adjustments that you're making to try to account for that missingness. And that's an art, like there's not known quantities that make that happen. And so if you mess that up, right, then you can kind of get really wrong answers, which is why we don't project based on that. So just to give you a flavor about why you don't project close races on it. So this is looking at the 2018 midterm elections. And so what it's looking at, the way it works is the exit polls are sent to, human interviewers are sent around the country to basically randomly selected precincts, such that those precincts are representative roughly of the particular state, right, that the exit polls are sent to. And so what this is showing you is that outside of each precinct, then the exit poll interviewer is going to has a rule to basically talk to like every 10th responder or something, right? Some kind of hard count rule to try to randomize who they're talking to, so they're just not approaching the people who are most approachable and trying to ask them. Now, whether they actually do that, unclear, right? But that's what they're supposed to do, like have some algorithm that moderates that. And so this shows you then like what the actual vote percentage is as compared to the exit poll. And so in particular, so these are the ballot returns, the exit poll responses that were taken at a particular precinct, which is the diamonds, and how those percentages for the Democrats and Republicans compare to the actual number of votes that were cast in that particular precinct, which are those X's. And so what you can see is that by and large, the diamonds are above the X's, which means that the people who are answering the exit poll were more likely to say they voted for the Democrats than actually voted in that particular precinct. So again, there was a systematic bias in 2018, and there's no reason to think it was different in kind of earlier or later years, that Democrats are more likely to take the exit poll than Republicans. Which means that if you just took those raw exit polls then and you try to project based on that, like that's not going to lead you to a happy place, right? So again, the people who are taking the exit polls seem to be some, just like all polls, may not be representative on their own without adjustment to the people who aren't taking it. So again, that's so exit polls, you hear a lot of talk about them, but they're really not where the action is, right? And they're kind of interesting sometimes, but they're also just a poll in the sense that they're a poll of known voters, but they're going to be dependent upon the adjustments that are being made behind the scenes. So let's talk about the vote, right? So that's what we really make the projections on. And so right off the bat, you can see that things are going to get wickedly complicated, to use a technical term, right? So one problem is that there's just no centralized source or format that collects the vote data for us. So in fact, what happens is there's 4,600 jurisdictions. So there's counties, which is where the vote's collected, or if you're in New England, they like doing towns for some reason because they like to be difficult, right? And so each state has different ways of aggregating the vote. And then within those counties and towns, there's like 120,000 precincts or thereabouts that collect, count, and report the vote. So again, there's no simple way that you can just log on and get the vote. Instead, there's tremendous heterogeneity in terms of how that vote's being collected and processed. Moreover, right, there's tremendous variation because we live in a federal system, right? And we left that power to the state legislatures as a check on the national government. That so states vary tremendously in how voters are able to vote, right? Some vote entirely by mail now, such as in Utah, for example, in Colorado. Others allow, election day voting or in-person early, like in Tennessee, or mail-in. That's not, it should be mail-in. It should be mail-in or kind of absentee voting. So again, that varies state by state in terms of how the votes are being collected, which has implications for how you analyze the data and when you get that data to be analyzed. And that's something that can change between election cycles. So moreover, states also vary in terms of how they count, like the rules that they use to determine the winner. So in Maine, for example, it's not just whoever gets the most votes wins necessarily, but instead they just change to a ranked choice voting, which means that the data that you get has to be analyzed differently than if you're in a state that just says whoever has the most votes wins. And then there's some states like Georgia, for example, that it doesn't matter if you have more votes than the other person, you need to pass a 50% threshold. Right. So in November, right. So even though both Republican candidates got more votes than the Democrats, it didn't matter because they didn't get 50%. It went to a runoff and then the Democrats won. So again, different states have different rules and that threshold, right. So it's not, so in Georgia, for example, it's not just, are you trying to estimate whether one candidate's ahead or not? It's like, is one candidate ahead or not? And is that candidate above 50% or not? So again, it changes the complexity of the task that you're trying to analyze. And that can change, as over time. Moreover, right, to make things even better, right, states vary in when the votes are counted. So for example, in Texas or Florida, they count in-person early vote prior to election day. And so that's why the first vote you get in Florida and Texas is just going to be a massive dump of all the early vote. Other places, such as Pennsylvania, for example, this last election cycle, they actually passed a specific rule that said you couldn't count the vote before election day. So again, states differ in terms of when they allow the vote to be counted, which is going to affect what types of vote that you get from the voting feed. Moreover, right, because everything's done at the county level, it's not even determined by the states, right? So in Pennsylvania, for example, in the case of 2020, like Philadelphia was counting its mail-in voters like crazy on election night, right? Because they knew that, I'm not going to say it's partisan, but it was a big Democratic city. And so they knew kind of where the vote was and there was this kind of narrative about, red shift, blue shift, whatever, right? So Philadelphia was massively focusing on counting its mail-in vote as soon as it can. In contrast, Allegheny in the western part of the state, which is more Republican leaning, they made a decision to count their election day vote first. So even within the same state, depending upon the control of who runs the Secretary of State in the counties, they can vary in the vote that they're counting. Moreover, counties can also decide how long they're going to vote for. And on the decision desk, like, we don't know when they're going to stop, right? So for example, the Iowa caucus was like a horrific horror show where we had no idea whether they're even trying to count the vote anymore. We just sat there for ages, right? It's like trying to call them, like, are you going to report the vote? Are you going to count anything? And we know you screwed the math up, but like, can you give us anything here or no? And the answer was like, no. But we don't know that, right? So counties themselves can make the decision about how long they want to count for. And that can vary, right? So this is a great tweet, right? Where Georgia just says, it's football Saturday, baby. We're done counting the vote. So because we got more important things to do, right? We have to focus on the important things sometimes. Go Dogs, right? So it's like, again, the county, it's up to the county official to make determinations about, they just don't count straight through, right? It's at their discretion about when they can count and when they want to stop to count, right? And that which has implications for the data that we see and we don't see, right? And then the final thing is that states vary in terms of how they report that data, right? So above and beyond all this other stuff, like where you go to actually get the data varies tremendously. So for example, if you want to find out how Michigan votes, good luck. This is the Secretary of State webpage in Michigan. And what it shows you says, like, you know what? We're not going to tell you. Instead, here are a bunch of links to the county Secretary of State pages, which may or may not work, which probably have different formats. And if you want to find a vote, go get it, right? So again, there's no centralized source by which you can actually get the data necessarily. Now, some states are fantastic, but some are not. But even the states that are fantastic, so for example, Pennsylvania, you'd be looking at them, there'd be discrepancies. So the numbers that were reported for Philadelphia County, for example, on the state page were very different from the ones that were being reported by the city of Philadelphia on its own page. And then you're like, well, what do I got here? Like, which one is right? Is the city one right? Probably, but you don't know that for certain. So that's like a good time, right? So then how do we actually get that data, right? So we have all this different data from all the places. And the reality is that there's a mishmash of things that we use. So some towns and counties have direct data feeds, right? That sometimes work. So you can actually just hook into the API, stream the data in, and then kind of feed that in the system. Some towns, counties, and states report their results on the web. But again, it's not always updated. It's not only timely, and it doesn't always match between the state and county pages. So that's the fun time. And then in addition to that, we employ at the National Election Pool, we employ about 1,800 vote reporters who we send around the country and whose job is basically to hang outside the door of these county election officials, and they figure out what their vote is and then call in and say, all right, I've got the latest vote, here's the deal. So-and-so votes this, so-and-so votes that way. So again, it's a highly manual process necessary, to kind of collect all this data. And the other thing to know is that this is just being done by the National Election Pool. Fox and the AP have to do a very similar process, right, to try to get their data, because again, there's no centralized and there's no agreement where the data is being shared, right? So again, this is the problem, right? So this is the data that we want to analyze, but you have to have all this process to try to figure out what data you're getting. And so the data that we're analyzing is being collected by the National Election Pool, but the Associated Press and Fox News are collecting different types of data, right? They're collecting the same data, to be clear, but like they have different processes. So if they don't have the 1,800 vote reporters, right, or if their vote reporters are someplace else, our data is not going to match their data. So for example, in 2020, there was some conversation that Facebook wanted to buy both data streams and put it together on the webpage to show that, to increase confidence in the election. But the problem was that that's not going to increase confidence in the election because those numbers are never going to match. And they're not going to match, not because the results are different, but because of how the data is reported, collected, and entered in the system that could vary across time. Related to that, there's so much hand coding going on, right? So the data that you're calling in, for example, if you're a reporter, right, you have computers there that you can enter, but there's a possibility of data entry. So 2000, for example, a lot of the problems there were that people that were entering the data wrong in Florida, right? And you could switch digits or add an extra zero, and that can make all the difference in a close election or not. So again, the other issue though, is that the data that you're getting is at the county level, right? And you have the number of precincts that are reporting that data, but the identity of those precincts is often unknown. And so we often don't have precinct level data. So I know, for example, that I get 15% of the data from Davidson County, for example, but I don't necessarily know what 15% of Davidson County I have the data from, right? And so if it's from Oak Hill, that's very different from East Nashville. And so without that context, it can be really hard to understand, like, all right, how do I interpret this national data vis-a-vis the past dating decisions I've had? And the other thing is, like, you don't know whether the county's ever done voting, right? As I said, so you never know. You know when it hits 100% of precincts, but especially in close elections, as I'll show, like you don't really know when the end of the election is. So Jesse, can I ask one question here? How long am I supposed to talk for? Like I should have asked this at the beginning, but.
That's right. So you have about another, let's say 20, 25 minutes, and then that'll give people time for questions.
Perfect.
But I do encourage people to break in with questions if you have them as well.
Perfect. So this is the problem, right? So you get the data from the county, but you don't have necessarily know what parts of the county it comes, and this can cause real problems. And so this is from like that special election, the Connor Lamb election in Pennsylvania. And so people were fixated with the needle that the New York Times did, which, and don't get me started on that. And they basically had to disable that because they said, we're getting data, but we have no idea what parts of the congressional district this data is from. And because there's heterogeneity in the district, like we have no confidence that we're able to project that by looking at relationships between the current data and the past data. So again, the data that you have is inherently crude in the sense that you don't always know where it's coming from in a particular county. Now, sometimes you do, right? Sometimes we have precinct level data that's great, but then other times you have partial precinct data. So for example, in the 2018 special election in the Jones election in Alabama, right? What happened is that they basically re-precincted the main two Democratic strongholds. And so you had good precinct level data for all the Republican places, but where all the Democratic vote was located, you had no idea because they re-precincted it. And so there was no way to kind of know how the current precincts related to past precincts and how to allocate those votes. And so it kind of really hampered your ability to kind of do the more parsimonious aspect. So the problem though, right? So that's you're getting all this data from all these different sources. And at the end of the day, like you want to make a prediction of what's going on. But the problem is that which related to that is that no one actually knows how many votes were cast, right, on election day. And without knowing that, it's hard to know a lot of different things. And so it's hard to predict who's going to win or who's going to lose, or whether a candidate can catch someone if you don't know how many votes are still outstanding. And in particular nowadays, what type of votes are outstanding. So here's just a couple of kind of horror shows from my PTSD experience kind of election week, right? So this was kind of like, again, looking at November 5th. So this is after election day, talking about what's going on in Pennsylvania as we're trying to figure out, can you call Pennsylvania? And this is kind of, from York, Pennsylvania. You can see that, there was like 92,000 provisional ballots have been cast in 44 counties, right? But Pennsylvania had 67 counties. So they had no idea how many provisional ballots were outstanding in the state, right? This is even multiple days after election day, right? And so in the narrow election, and you don't even know how many provisional ballots are out there, that's going to be really hard to predict because you don't want to make a mistake there. And so this is even the Secretary of State has no idea how many provisional ballots there are in various counties across the state.
And a quick question, provisional ballot, that's one that may or may not count because you're unsure if you voted the right place or
that's right.
Or registered.
Yeah, so provisional ballots are what happens if you go to some place and you're not sure if you can vote or not. So in Pennsylvania, though, this was a particular issue because what happened is that they held their primaries in the spring during the pandemic. And so what happened then is that they automatically mailed all the ballots to everyone who voted in a primary. And so if you're a Republican, for example, who wanted to vote on election day, right, because you didn't trust the mail, or if you're a Democrat who was reading all the horror stories about the mail not being delivered and you decided to vote on election day, the way it worked is that you could only vote on election day if you brought both the ballot on and all the envelopes associated with that ballot to election day and turned it in when you cast your ballot. If you were missing an envelope, right, then you were not allowed to cast a ballot, you had to cast a provisional ballot. And so the rules that they had, which vary state by state in like bizarro ways, because like, why not? Let's make things fun, right? Can have real implications. So you can look at that, all right, so there's 92,000 votes. And so, normally provisional ballots go for Democrats, right? But maybe not in this election cycle because of these particular rules, right? In particular, since Republicans are likely to vote on election day, and a lot of them voted in a Republican primary, so you never know, right? And you don't know until the votes are cast. So that's a good time. Right. This is another example. Like this is like literally the data that we got. So this is some reporter standing in Clark County in the Secretary of State webpage. And so what they did here is, again, they're telling us basically provisional ballots in Clark County and how that breaks down by basically party registration on whether they're same day registration, online same day registration, or whether they chose to update their registration, trying to figure out how many ballots are left. And so, for example, in Clark County, you can see that basically there was 23,000 same-day registration in-person votes that are there. And so again, we're trying to like process all this information. This isn't in any system, right? This is some guy in the Secretary of State office in Clark County taking a photo, taking a picture on their phone about what the breakout is, emailing it to a reporter, and the reporter then emailing the decision desk and saying, "What are you going to do with this?" And I'm like, "I have no idea what I'm going to do with this. I'm going to like not call the race. I know that much." Right. So again, you're dealing with this information, and it's all it's telling you is that there's a lot of uncertainty here. Right. So you can put Nate Silver on Twitter and say, "Well, they should call this race because we know how many votes are left." Like, no, you don't. You have no. We have no idea. They don't even know how many votes are left. Right. And so again, that process of trying to figure out how much vote is left is like really super critically important. Okay, so that's kind of the vote, right? Which is uncertain, right? And you're kind of dealing with that as it comes in. And again, it's not just like my data is clean. You're saying you're making an assessment like, I don't know how much data I have. I don't know whether my data is representative of the data that's been reported, and I don't know how much data is out there, right? So that's not good. That's not a good place.
So Josh, quick question.
Yep.
So when I'm looking on a place like CNN and they're showing the map and they're saying, this county has 40% of the vote left to count. That, which sounds like they know how many people have voted. Is that just the day of voting, and it doesn't have these other kinds of ballots, or what are they referring to?
That is an estimate. That's an estimate of how much they think the vote has. So again,
using the same data that you have. That's
right. So CNN gets the same data that we have, right? And like our expected votes will match CNN. But you think about what that process looks like, right? And that's a tricky, that's an estimate based on early vote returns, based on election voter file data, based on, but it doesn't count provisional ballots, and those estimates can be really, really wrong. And there can also be differential turnout across different counties. So it's like, so that's what they say. And so if you actually watch election coverage, you'll notice that those numbers will change sometimes, like subtly in the middle of the night, right? When we kind of realize that those numbers are too low or kind of too high. And so again, those are all estimates that we're making for precisely these reasons. Like the Secretary of State doesn't even know how many votes are being cast in most of these times, right? So that's an issue, but that's a great question. So what do we do with this data that we have, right? Besides just kind of like shake our heads at it and say, I can't believe this is what I have to work with. Well, there's two different ways that we think about trying to model that data. One is that we try to work with the data that we have to make a projection about what we think the end of the night is going to look like. So who's going to win? So, given the county level data that we've collected so far, historical voting patterns that we have, which we have extensive patterns of that, and county level demographics and voter files, stuff like that, like how can we use the data that we have and that historical data to try to make a projection about what's going to happen, going forward, right? And so you can kind of think that there's lots of different ways to do that, and and you'd probably be right in terms of how that's being done. The other way of trying to do that is to flip that question, right? Which is kind of more useful as we get more vote, which is basically how likely is it that the trailing candidate is going to find enough vote to basically catch and pass the leading candidate, right? So the first one is kind of what we use early on as vote starts coming in. But as we get closer to kind of 70%, 80%, 90% of the vote remaining, we can kind of see, like using this estimate again that Andreas talked about, like where is the vote out? How does the patterns of the vote look like to date? And how likely do we think it is that the candidate who's trailing can find enough votes in the vote that we think is still out to basically catch the election, right? So there's some sense they're very, very, very similar, but they're just two different ways of kind of thinking about the world that we use. But of course, there's lots of challenges to this, right? So there's a lot of uncertainty that we have. So again, we're uncertain which vote and precincts we have from each county, especially early on. As it gets close, we know that information. And moreover, the pattern that we get, the pattern of votes that we get can vary tremendously. So in Texas, we get all the in-person vote early, right? That's the first vote we have. But you can't project based on that because you have no idea what the election day vote is going to look like. So you have to wait to see how much election day vote is there going to be in the election, and how does that differ from the early vote before you can do much of anything there. Sometimes in some states, you have rural, largely Republican counties count quickest, such as Virginia. So if you look at what happened in Virginia, Republicans had a huge lead, and then kind of Biden overtook that. Sometimes states I don't know what states are doing. So California, for example, it literally takes them multiple weeks to call a race, right? And so if there's a close House race there, like just kiss it goodbye. You're never gonna be able to call that. They just take so long because they give voters so long to turn their ballots in, that it can take a long time for that to do it. And again, so work on this point, like you need to estimate how much vote remains, how much nowadays, what type of vote that is, and how that vote's going to break. And then sometimes the counties will break that out data for you, and sometimes they'll all lump it together. It's like, here's some vote. You say, well, how much of that is early vote? How much is that election day vote? And they say, well, we don't know. We just kind of all lumped it together. And you're like, well, thank you very much. That's really helpful, right? So like the data that you get in terms of trying to analyze is very varied, right? And it can vary like by county and even by vote drop sometimes, depending on how they're breaking that out. So that's like not great news. The good news, kind of, although it can be, you can overinterpret, is that we have a ream of historical data, right? We have second by second data feed of all the past election results, like for like lots and lots of election cycles. But of course, the problem is that you don't know how useful that is, right? Because how quickly a county counted their vote last time doesn't mean how quickly they're going to count it this time, right? We saw that all the time in 2020 being messed up, or maybe they changed how they vote. Right, so the correlational structures of past and prior elections, both between counties and also within vote reports within a county, is unclear. It can because it vary by candidates, it can vary by voting uniforms, it can even vary by weather effects there. And so there's lots of uncertainty that you just can't take the past as a predictor of what the future is necessarily going to be. And so this can cause issues, right? And so like this is like an example. Again, this is after election day, right? So this is November 8th. Right, at 7:31 p.m. that Fox was predicting. And so that they obviously nailed it, right? So Republicans are going to win the Senate with 95% probability, like that's good. Trump was going to win with 79% probability, and they did get the House of Representatives right, but should not have been 95% though, I'll tell you that much, because the Democrats barely held on to that. So again, this kind of highlights, right, the difficulty of this, and then more often than that, like, it also highlights how you quantify that uncertainty, right? Because there's no way that I would say that any of these probabilities would be right? We're basically a split Senate, so that it should not be 95%. Biden won, so it should be 79%. Trump won, right? And the House of Representatives was barely won by the Democrats, so that's not a 95% to me either, right? And so how you think about quantifying the uncertainty that you have, given all of the uncertainty that I just talked about, is a really, really challenging task, and especially because you don't want to make it wrong. And so here's just an example of kind of how that changes across the night for a particular state to kind of highlight how the type of data that you're getting is very heterogeneous. And so this is Pennsylvania, for example, how that vote margin changes across time, depending upon which counties are counting the vote and what type of vote they're counting within those particular counties. And you can see, and then this varies, right? So this is Pennsylvania, but there were different patterns in other states. And so in Pennsylvania, right, it turned out that Biden ran up a lead, and then all of a sudden, bam, that kind of switched over, and then Trump started winning. And then Trump his lead kept growing and growing and growing and growing until it didn't. And then it started falling back down until Biden, right? And so again, when you don't know how much vote's left, right, and this vote changes this much, and you don't know what type of vote you're getting from the counties and how much vote is left, that creates a really challenging circumstance to try to make a prediction about when are you 99.5% certain, right, about who's going to win, especially at the end of the day when the margin's 45,000 votes, right? And so again, the level of precision that's required, given all that uncertainty, is really remarkable. So to give you a sense, so here's another snapshot that kind of dives a little bit deeper to kind of show you a little bit of what we look at on the decision desk. And so this is an example of a snapshot of the data. And so these are taking all the counties of Pennsylvania and basically aggregating them into different strata, right? So basically just doing a cluster analysis to figure out which counties are more or less similar in terms of partisanship, right? And so that you have like moderate Democrats, Republicans kind of in Philadelphia, because Philadelphia is special, right? And you can see basically the data, the last vote update that we got from any place in that strata, from any county who reported data. You can see how many precincts that we got, at this particular point in time that were reporting vote and how many were still out there. You have this number of the expected vote, right? Again, based on our expectation about how much vote we thought was outstanding, overall, and the size of these various strata that we thought, how much vote we thought was going to be outstanding, the expected vote, and then kind of the outstanding vote that's there, how much vote had already been counted. And then we had some ability to kind of tease out basically the absentee vote and also the non-absentee vote in Philadelphia. And then more often than that, so you can see there's lots of different variation in terms of how much absentee vote there was in a particular state or not, right? And then also the other interesting thing is like how that vote's breaking. So for example, in Philadelphia, right, the overall margin of vote of all the votes cast was basically pro-Biden by 63 points, right? So it's a massive Democratic stronghold. Among early votes and absentee votes, Biden was winning by 88% of the vote, okay? That's a massive shift. But more troubling for someone who's trying to analyze data and you don't know what data you have and how much is left is look at the very bottom. So the very bottom are those kind of high Republican places. And so good news for us is that we didn't think there was much vote left here, right? There's only 3,360 votes that we thought left. But look at the differences in the margin, right? So the margin among early vote was plus 24 for Biden, right? So Biden was winning the early vote by a lot. But the overall margin of all of the votes that are being cast in that strata, in those counties, was 40 points for Trump. So again, depending upon the type of votes that were being cast, you got very, very different answers. And so again, analyzing that data, you need to know how much vote you have, what type of vote that is, and then how much vote is left, not just overall, but the various particular types of votes that are being cast. So again, that's a lot of quantities that you have to estimate to try to figure out, to interpret before you're being certain. So this is just a summary then of like how much that changed, right? Of course, election night. So again, this is looking from basically 6 a.m. on the 4th. So this is the day after election, right? When I should have already been home or not, or actually I should have been in the car driving home or not, all the way up to basically the November 7th, right? So this is over that course of those days, which I have no recollection of, how much did the overall vote share in each state swing? And you can see that in some places, the margins tightened. In some places, the margins widened. And in other places, the who won actually switched. So again, the task is very difficult and it's very heterogeneous in terms of different processes are going on in different states and in different counties. And sometimes those numbers don't move a lot. And then sometimes they move massively. Sometimes they move massively and that matters because it swings who's going to win. And sometimes it does not. Right? So again, the whole task is trying to figure out how much votes remaining and how do you make estimates about that. So again, the question is that it's really, really hard to project when you don't know what the data generating process is, right? You don't know how much data is left. You don't know how that vote differs. And you're trying to make your best estimate in a way that you don't make a mistake, because making a mistake would be super, super bad. So speaking of mistakes, so here's just kind of like walking through, for example, one call that was made that everyone says looks fantastic in hindsight, but let's kind of just think about it for a little bit. So this is kind of a critical call, right? It's kind of the story of election night in some sense. So this is the call that Biden was going to win Arizona, right? So this is the screen that was called. It was at 9:21 Mountain Time. I guess it's 8 o'clock. I don't know, 10 o'clock Central Time. Right. And so this is kind of when Fox News called Arizona for Biden. And so you can see that there were estimated 73% of vote in. So again, that number is an estimate. So 73% of the vote estimated was in. And you can see the margin that was there. It's about, 200,000 votes. 200,000 votes on 73% of the vote in. And so on the basis of this, they called the election for Arizona. And this, of course, changed the entire narrative, right? It changed the entire mood of the White House. It changed the entire, recollection of what was going on. So I just want to show you kind of where that vote actually was. So we did not call that race because I said, we looked at that day, so there's no way that we know with 99.5% certain who's going to win, especially when the final outcome was like 10,000 votes. Like, I defy you, there's no way anyone could know given how much a vote was left, but anywho. So you can see that when they called that, remember, there was like 71% of the vote in. So basically they called it right before all of the narrowing, right? So at basically not the maximum point, because the maximum point was early on the night, like before 25%, but they called it like right before they kind of the jut in and the kind of the narrowing, occurred there. And so in terms of how much the vote was reported there. And so at the end of the day, right, this was a race that Biden won by 10,457 races. Like if you think about the entire election, right, the thing that's kind of mind blowing is that the 2020 election was really decided by about 40,000 people in 3 different states, right? It was narrower than 2016. 2016 was decided by 73,000 people in 3 different states. 2020, right, despite everything that happened in 2020, was even closer. It was 40,000 votes, was the difference between President Trump being reelected and President Biden. So again, we forget that, but that's really tight. And Arizona was super tight in particular, like 11,000 votes, right? And you're trying to predict who's going to win. And this is a state that was going to flip from Trump because Trump won in 2016. So super consequential, right? Because if you flip a state, that's a big sign, especially if you call that race on election night. And so here, the final race was 11,000 votes. So this is the problem, right? So as we talked about the expected vote. So here's just like a report. So this is like the day after. So this is based on November 4th. So this is after election day, after it was already called by Fox and the Associated Press. And after that election day, you can still see that Arizona itself has no idea how many votes are out, right? This is from Maricopa County, which is the largest county in Arizona, like where a lot of the vote was. And they themselves say they have no idea. They said, well, it's maybe 600, They don't know the number of election day votes that were dropped off between 160,000, 180,000, right? That's a big margin when the final margin is 10,000 votes, right? And they have no idea how many votes actually were cast. They said, well, it's somewhere north of 600,000. Again, that's a lot of votes if you think that things could be narrowed quite considerably, right? And moreover, they were only able to get even numbers from 12 out of 15 counties the day after, right? And so then this is like a really hard task. And you're going to know that you can project that the night before based on an exit poll, which is what they did, which you don't do, right? So again, it's really, really complicated that you're trying to make a projection here. And so moreover, like this is the data that we use. So we didn't call this until the 12th. So like well after election day, like I think that was the 9 days or something like that. So like every single day, it would be like our morning update from Maricopa. You'd get your coffee, you'd walk in the decision desk and say, what did Maricopa have to say? And they'd kind of leave you hanging and say, well, we're going to report the vote at 11 o'clock. And they say, well, what time is that? And kind of in Eastern time. But anyway, so this is this was being reported as of November 9th, right? So as of November 9th, right, they still said, right, that if you look in just Maricopa County alone, right, and there's 15 counties in Arizona, Maricopa is the largest, but it's not the only one. Even as of November 9th, they still had 13,568 early votes left to process. They had an estimated number of 2,300 early votes, and they had 18,000 provisional ballots. Now, again, the race was decided by 10,000 votes, right? And they don't even know what that is. And moreover, how those votes were shifted. So you can't just say Democrats voted early, because especially in Arizona, as you got close to election day, that early vote turned more and more Republican. So Democrats, they were all fired up. So they cast their early votes on first opportunity they could. So the early batches of votes that we got were really, really super Democratic. And as it got closer to election day, that vote became more and more Republican. So again, you're trying to make an estimate here. The Maricopa County doesn't even know how much vote it has left with certainty on November 9th, right? That's like nearly a week after the election. And the final outcome is like tightening, and it's less than 10,000 votes. So again, it wasn't until we didn't even call on November 9th. We still said I am not 99.5% sure. Gun to my head, would I think that Biden wins? Yeah, I think that's right. And I was thinking that in November 9th, but I'm not 99.5% sure. I can still see a path where that switches, and I don't want to be called in front of Congress to kind of justify that, because I thought it looked good, right? That's not a reliable assumption, right? There's no way you could justify that. At least I could not justify kind of that decision. So again, that was like the decision that was made there. So that's all that I really have. Hopefully that was not too much. But again, there's a lot going on. It's super interesting because it's not just statistics per se, right? And there's our statistics that goes on, but the most difficult part is almost trying to interpret what you have and what you don't have. And that's as much as art as it is science. I can write the best statistical model. Well, probably not, because I'm not that good, but I can write a pretty good statistical model going into election day, right? But if the data comes in differently, or if it's a different type of election than it was in the past, right, then you're kind of forced to basically react in real time to try to figure out how representative is my data, right? How much vote do I think is outstanding? How can I do those analysis on the fly in a way that gives me confidence of what we have? And then at the same time, you're trying to make sure you have all the vote, because you don't even, that data that you're getting is uncertain validity. So even if I'm conditional on the vote I have, right, it's complicated. And then you have all these QA concerns, and then you hope you don't lose your connections. And then you have people screaming in your ear about when are you going to call so-and-so a state race? What's going on in that state? And I have no idea. Literally nobody has any idea how much vote is left in that county, but that's not what they want to hear, because they've got a number on their screen that says it says they only have 10,000 votes left. And they're like, well, yeah, that's what we said. But it turns out that, there's a plus or minus on that you don't want to know about, because it would kind of, make you sad. So anywho, so hopefully that was somewhat illuminating. I know it was a little bit ambiguous, and there's kind of a lot of stuff going on there, but it was it's super interesting, and it's always super fun to kind of share this, because I think it's super important for what's being done, for help giving some insight, but it's also super complicated and great.
Let's go ahead and take questions. What questions do you have for Josh?
Josh,
Joe.
I've got a question. Could you go back to your very first screen, the one of the photo in '68?
Okay. Yes. Let me do that. You're not going to quiz me, are you?
No, this is really cool.
Okay.
Pretty sure I know who one of the people is in the picture.
All right.
So front and center, shaking hands. I'm pretty sure that's John Tukey right there. I know he was there in '68.
I think,
I know that he was on the team in '68, and I'm pretty sure that's Tukey.
Wow.
yeah, I think,
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah, I mean, the people who developed the system were like rock star statisticians. Like it's, you know, this was the thing to do, right? And so it was, yes.
That's fantastic. Great. Other questions? Yes, Indusha.
I guess mine might take like an entire other lecture to like answer, but I'm from Maricopa County. And like it was really annoying like watching the election results because like because I was from there, so I like kind of knew or kind of was guessing like we would like Arizona would flip blue, like that was what I was thinking. But like I think more generally it was really annoying to have to see people calling races like as soon as like results are coming in. And I was wondering if you had like an idea about like how we stop kind of like the horse race of like media trying to call races before like any data or results are in. And because like I feel like so much chaos was caused by people trying to call races, and it like led to a lot of misinformation, people getting stressed and angry, and like I don't know, it's like not good, which I feel like you communicated throughout the entire lecture. But do you have any ideas about, you know, how we stop that?
Yeah, I mean that is a super great question, right? And it's something that you also concern about, right? And that like if you call a race, so it used to be that there was like no restrictions, and so people would like make calls like as literally as soon as they could, right? And so they'd call a presidency before the polls would even close on the West Coast. And then that could, you know, then there's concern that then you're basically disenfranchising people, right? Because like, if I'm not going to vote, if I already know that, for example, if Reagan's going to beat Mondale, like, why should I vote? Well, turns out your vote matters, right? Even if Reagan does go win the presidency in 1980, like, who's getting elected to the House of Representatives, or who's getting elected to the local city council or the school board, right? Those are phenomenally important races that really are, you know, in some sense, maybe even more impactful, right, than who's sitting up in kind of the White House. And so I think that you are exactly right, that there is this trade-off, right? There's this trade-off between trying to figure out transparency in some sense about how the votes are being cast and kind of what that looks like. And then at the same time, like this rush of judgment to kind of like try things, call votes quickly in ways that could then result in people being disenfranchised or kind of other aspects. But the problem is that in a competitive environment that we live in, I'm not sure what that looks like unless there's some kind of, you know, a rule by Congress and would say you can't do that. But on the other hand, like I do think there is some looking inside and see as the votes come in, like, you know, that makes me feel good from a small d democratic perspective, in the sense that now I can see I have some notion about how the election was constructed and kind of how it changed. That kind of made sense to me. And it's not just, for example, you know, state legislatures saying, well, your votes don't count. We're just going to kind of, you know, appoint a kind of who the electors, the electoral college are. And so I think that you're exactly right, that there's a really interesting discussion about exactly how you make that trade-off. And that's a discussion that I don't think is really occurring, you know, nowadays. But thank you so much for the question.
Stephen.
No, yeah. So I think that was an excellent question. And it's like, I have a very similar question regarding this. And so I'm going to push you a little bit on this, Josh, in which, what is the benefit? Like, so I am going to say this as someone who DVRs multiple channels so I can watch multiple election results like on the same night during your commercial breaks. And so I am with this, but like Eden Hirsch, like, for example, makes the argument of like hobbyism, like in terms of politics.
Yep.
And so I agree, we want transparency in terms of the elections, but how much is that transparency worth versus just waiting until 7 a.m. in the morning and then letting you make a report on the Today Show, in which then we aren't going to have the Fox News problem at all in the same way, just taking a little bit of time. So like for democracy, what is the normative good of doing it on the night of versus the next day?
I think that's a great question. Would make my life easier, right? If like there wasn't this pressure, like, you know, call as quickly as you can, and you actually have the, you know, you can go to bed, Josh. You're not going to be called at 2 o'clock in the morning when we get a new vote. But I think I think that is a great question, right? Like, what is the value of having real time updates and kind of tracking, and especially given there's uncertainty in this data. And I think I think the reality is that it's being made by competitive pressures, right? It is, it's a moneymaker. Everyone watches it. Like you're DVRing all these different races because it's like, it's not a train wreck, but I guess it kind of is like a train wreck. Like you want to see what happens in real time, and everyone knows that. And so given that there's a demand for it and people are trying to make money, feed the beast kind of situation. But like if you were abstract it, right? If you're to say, normally in the best idealistic world, would you probably do this? Like, why would you do this? Like, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to try to, when you risk making errors because you're trying to collect all this data, right? And there might be tabulation, so I think like normatively, right? It's good to see kind of what's going on, but like this minute by minute real time, I think there is that trade-off there. And the reality is that right now it's being driven by like, there's tremendous demand for this, right? And you can try to rationalize that, and but I think it is what it is. But that's a great question, Captain America.
So Josh, we are at 3:01. Would you be available to stick around for a few more minutes? We had 2 more questions, but for those who had to leave, let's give Josh a round of applause. Thank you so much. This was sadly very entertaining. I wish it were just boring, and then we count and then we all know. But so thank you very much. For those of you who have to take off, we'll see you soon. We hope to see you for our next series. I think this was this the last for the spring series? Yeah. So we'll have this again in the fall. But if you have a question now, Frizzell, if you'd like to ask, and I'm sorry for mispronouncing your name.
Yeah. So thank you for the great talk. I have 2 questions. So one question is, how do you make your algorithms adaptable to such uncertainty of your data? And my other question is kind of like a solution is like, do you think in the future there will be a centralized ways to report votes?
Yeah, so I'll take the second one. The second one's easier. The answer is no, right? Like, states, as we see, right? States are very particular about the power that they exercise. And so one of the things that's in the Constitution is that each state is given the power to do the time, place, manner of conducting its elections. And so, insofar as that people think of political power can be influenced by how elections are done and counted, like I just don't see any kind of process by which they're going to centralize that. Now, could there be some tech firm that kind of comes in and tries to offer to standardize all that? Yes, but like I'm not sure the climate is such that people would be receptive to that. And so like I think it's unfortunate that the way that the world is, in the sense that everything's kind of decentralized, but I don't see any incentives that currently exist that would kind of mitigate that. In terms of your first point about how do you account for all the insanity, and that's kind of recharacterizing your statement for what's going on, the answer, that's a great question. I mean, the best that we can do is try to do basic sensitivity analysis, right? I mean, I think that's the best way you can try to do it, is try to like figure out a kind of game plan, different scenarios, using the patterns that you get and making different assumptions about how that might correspond to what you're going to see in the future, and then trying to use that kind of sensitivity analysis to try to see how robustly are the predictions that you're making to variations and deviations from the pattern that you're seeing. And so that's the best that we can do, given like as given all the uncertainty that we have about what's there. And so you basically want to see how wrong would I have to be to make a mistake if I call this race, and then how credible does those assumptions appear to be in light of what we've seen so far, in light of kind of what we see kind of going around the country. But that's a great question. So real-time modeling, it's kind of the way that we handle it, kind of more about in terms of the sensitivity and robustness, rather than trying to like game plan all in advance what's going on. And then combined with that, like inevitably we're writing code, like when we're kind of stuck in that room, trying to rip out data, trying to do other different predictions, trying to figure out, like even if it's in a particular county, like Maricopa, like how can we analyze the data that we have? Or like in Pennsylvania, we did this insane thing where we actually got the names of all the Secretary of State's county by county. And like we had a whole team that was working through the list and calling them and emailing them and tweeting at them to try to figure out how many provisional ballots do you have? Because there was no list, right, about where that was. And so we were basically just doing ingenuity and just like all old school, I guess, journalism, as it were. I mean, not that I'm a journalist, but like trying to call up the individual people and say, well, how many books do you have? Like, will you be my friend? Will you be my Twitter follower? Right. So, but basically trying to figure out as best we could how much data was outstanding there that we could then kind of feed in to kind of figure out, all right, let's adjust things. What must the margin be in that vote? And is there enough vote that's outstanding? Like, even if it all went for Trump, for example, that would flip the race. And so at the end of the process, like that's how we called the race at the end of the day. Like we saw a vote coming in for Philadelphia, we had some sense how much vote was left. We could make a calculation, like we called all those Secretary of States at the county level. We knew how many provisional ballots were left, even if they all flipped and they 100% voted for Trump, there just wasn't enough vote left. And so once we were able to nail down what that denominator was, right, and that wasn't statistical, that was like an email or kind of calling thing, then we were confident that we call the race, but not until then. But that's an excellent question.
Thank you.
If you have time, we have 2 more questions. You have a few more minutes?
Yeah.
Great. Dan.
Hi, good afternoon. I was wondering, I'm thinking about the election night in 2000 when they called Florida for Al Gore.
Yep.
And then later that night they said it was too close to call, and then they called it for George W. Bush, and then they retracted that too. I was wondering, what have they done since then to improve the process of calling elections?
Super great question. So one thing they've done is it used to be like all the networks would explicitly collaborate, right? And so like they would all be using the same models, the same data, and they'd all be in conversation with one another. And so one thing that as a result of Florida is basically the networks promised Congress that they would not collude with one another. And right, so they would all develop their own different processes as one check, right? That they wouldn't have the same kind of mistake. The other thing is that that error, there was issues in terms of data entry, in terms of kind of candidate vote totals were flipped, right? And this was back in the 2000s, like when data was being entered by fingers, and that was like not good. And so one other thing, as you might think, is that you can just program in a bunch of sensitivity or kind of data quality assurance tests to kind of say like, if the wrong candidate's winning historically, like just flag that to get a second pair of eyes. And so there's been a whole lot of like QA checks that have been built into the system to try to prevent that from happening again. But it is an issue that kind of looms large, right? And it kind of affects people, right? So for example, and it also kind of scars people in some sense. So you think about that Fox call in Arizona, right? And as that was tightening and tightening and tightening and tightening. Now, I still think that at the end of the day, like, they're likely to be right? I mean, that was my guess. It was like 60%. It wasn't 99.5% this year, but like, I think, I'm pretty sure they also thought that, like, despite what you hear in the paper nowadays, but like, the also is like, you can't undo, right? So there's a real temptation not to undo that, right? So there's this kind of like, let's be careful. And then if we do make a mistake, like, I'm not going to admit my mistake until like, I have to, right? Because like because if I want to undo it, I do not want to be like a flip flopper, right? I don't want to do the Florida dance again. So again, that's like a particular instance, but I think there's long-term implications in terms of how we try to do QA for the data itself, basically disaggregating the different decision desks. And then also it kind of does change the incentive a little bit about how quickly you're going to call something. And then when you do make a call, like what do you do if you're worried about it? But great questions.
Thank you.
Tom.
So my sense is that this past election was crazier than most, but I assume that every election is crazy in its own unique way. But I guess the question I had was kind of on a typical year, and then how much different this past election was, but in a typical election, how long in advance are your statistical models and data pipelines established? And then how much in a typical year versus this past year, because you mentioned this in your response to one of the previous questions, that there was a lot of coding and changing on election day. Is that the norm? Are things usually pretty well pipelined and then it's a matter of tweaking, or is it really every year you kind of have a general sense of how you're going to be analyzing the data, but then you need to be making changes as you kind of realize what data is coming in on the fly and kind of either adjust the models or adjust the way their assumptions are coded, kind of what works normally, and maybe what's normally was true for this year as much as it is for every other year. Kind of how does that work, and how much time is taken in advance of establishing those models, and how much do they change?
Great question. So usually all the systems are locked down at least a month prior to election day, right? And so like a month before, like everything's locked down, nothing can be changed. And so a lot of the things that you're doing in response to that are something you're just doing in in R, Python, you're kind of doing that in different, you're outside the system because you don't want to touch the system and you don't want to, for all the obvious reasons. And so the difficulty, like this election cycle was particularly nightmarish and hellish because like of the rules themselves, right, were changing right up to like a week before the election day. And no one like early voting or kind of how people were being reported, like there was lawsuits that were ongoing that were just impossible to plan. And so, you know, we didn't even know like what that system was going to be. And so the system that we tried to have some advance of that, but they weren't, for example, they didn't put a real emphasis on collecting all the different types of vote necessarily. So they did the best job they could, but that really hamstrung you in some places. So, you know, Pennsylvania was great in that respect. But other places, you know, we had like special, you know, spreadsheets and doing stuff to try to like disaggregate and do models, you know, by different, you know, quota. But like in terms of timeline, for example, I think I have a conference call like next week or something where we're starting to think about, you know, 2020 and 2018, like already kind of thinking about what adaptations do we have to make. But it's also, that's also really super hard, right? Because like you have all these like, what are you going to do as more states adopt ranked choice voting? Like, and how do you think about modeling that? How is that data even going to be reported out in ways that allow you to process, like, and you have no idea. And the problem is like you talk to some of the people on the technical side and they don't know either, right? So the answers that you get from them, it's hard to plan for that, you know, in advance. And so it's inevitably just, it's just really a challenging or, you know, logistical nightmare trying to figure out, you know, what those are. And so like, you know, I know what the models ought to be in a perfect world, give me the data, but I don't know like what data I'm going to be able to access to, right? And what format that's going to get and how timely it's going to be. And the other, you know, so that, and because the data is all collected, right, by this consortium, right, that's also good times because now everyone has a say, right? Because it's really costly to do so. And so you're only going to get the data if you can convince all of the other networks that this is data that's worth getting. But then like, you know, they may not think, they may see the value of, they may evaluate, you know, they say, we really love exit polls, so we want to spend more money on exit polls. Like, well, I don't want to spend money on exit polls. I want to get more vote data because that's what I really trust. So there's those conversations that's kind of political. That's also kind of really, really super fun. And then the other thing is that, you know, there is this kind of status quo bias in some sense, right? Because like you want to innovate, but it's one of those things that if you innovate too much and things go wrong, like it's your butt on the line, right? So there's this kind of CYA kind of, you know, aspect where, you know, there's a strong, you know, motivation to just do what we did last time, even though you have reason to think that may not be the best thing process, like if you were by yourself. And so it's like a multi-year process, right? So like we're starting right now to kind of think about, you know, 2018, but that's really super hard to plan for because you have no idea what that's even going to look like. I mean, not 2018, obviously that I'm going back in time on my TARDIS, right? But like 2022, right? And then kind of also kind of 24. And so
your team just does the congressional, Senate, and presidential elections then? So it's always the even years?
Yeah. And
Okay.
that, but yeah. So, and also, but even that's like a debate, like you call individual House races, for example, or you just control the House. And so one year, I think I was tasked with like leading the decision desk to call individual House races. And that's just like a complete nightmare, right? Because then all these data problems are just like orders of magnitude more difficult because they give a district, like, how do you call New York City races, right? I mean, like without precinct level data, and if all you have is county level data and you have, you know, districts that are split across counties and you don't, you know, so then you have to like figure out assumptions about how to allocate vote. I mean, it's like, it is just nightmarish. And then you want to quantify how much precision you have about these assumptions that you're making. And it's like, you know, good luck with that. And they change the districts and then like, you know, what past vote data had, you know, so yeah, it's good times. It's interesting, but it's like good times.
Well, Josh, thank you again very much for a very, very entertaining and informative. Thank you so much. Thank you everybody for attending and for sticking around for the last questions. Josh, thanks for your extra time as well. We hope to see you at our workshops and also at our other events, which we'll have in the fall. Thank you all. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Josh.